Hello, thank you for coming to the Philip K. Dick Hour. My name is Dan Abella, and I am the organizer of the Philip K. Dick Festival. For those who haven't heard of the festival, it was created back in 2012, and the goals of the festival was to basically develop a program that would help us in promoting the ideas of Philip K. Dick. Now, a lot of you probably have heard of Philip K. Dick. You've probably seen him in some of his adaptations in the movies, whether it be Blade Runner, Minority Report, um, Scanner Darkly, as well as more recently the Radio Free album, which we screened in 2013. But a lot of people have not heard of his ideas. They're not really that familiar with what he stands for. When they think of Philip K. Dick, they think of, well, he's just a sci-fi writer. He's a good one. He kind of had the pulse on what's happening right now with technology and what's happening with the world. And that's true. In fact, Philip K. Dick, more than anyone else, I think, is able to sense how technology is starting to impact our humanity. However, his impact and his influence goes way beyond that. In fact, Philip K. Dick used to refer himself as a fictionalizing philosopher. That is, he incorporated ideas of philosophy, which normally are very abstract and very confusing to most people, and incorporated them into a format which was easy to understand, easy to read, easy to appreciate, and also more practical. Now, the goal of our festival, going for those who just joined us, the Philip K. Dick Film Festival, it's called the Black Iron Prison: How to Escape the Matrix. The goal of our festival is essentially first was to help people bring together filmmakers that under one roof, one umbrella, where we're able to appreciate and really understand important ideas beyond just sheer sci-fi. So a lot of the films in Philip K. Dick that we show are not focused, they're not heavily focused in the future in the year 3100 or dealing with what's referred to in the vernacular as soap operas. They deal with the here and now, or more specifically, they deal with what's going on right now, what will be going on in the future. For instance, I'll give you a perfect example. Minority Report, for those who haven't heard of, was written based upon a novella written by Philip K. Dick many, many years ago. And then it was adapted by Steven Spielberg back in the late 90s, or I think early late 90s, into a movie called Minority Report starring Tom Cruise. And the idea at that point was that the world had evolved to a point where there would be profiling of people, what is referred to as profiling people before they committed crimes. And they were using this information through these systems called precogs. Now, at that time, it seemed like a crazy idea. The idea of profile, catch someone before they even commit a crime. But unfortunately, technology is catching up very quickly with what Philip K. Dick was warning us about. In fact, as you might have seen in some of our posts, right now in Florida and other states, there's already precog or profiling of potential criminals. And this is basically using the information that's been obtained from the database, various databases, and trying to, using prediction analytics and other AI tools, what are the chances this particular person will commit a crime? So that we're already heading in that direction. For those who haven't read my latest post back in a couple of days ago, there's already something called in his novel, The Penultimate Truth. This where we talking about a machine that was able to churn out information at the equivalent of Chat GPT driven by AI. So there's no doubt that Philip K. Dick has a finger on the pulse on where we're heading, and unfortunately, how technology is starting to warp our sense of humanity. And that's really the most important thing I want to start driving across is this, that our humanity is probably our most precious gift, and yet is what we're just giving it away in favor of supporting technologies and systems that are particularly anti-human in nature. What Philip K. Dick promoted and advocated was not so much a Luddite interpretation. Oh, let's forget about technology. Let's just run to the hills and all become Amish. Nothing against Amish, but that's not what he was saying. He was saying is we need to really find that fine balance between technology and uh, between technology and humanity. Now, humanity used to be taught, and used to, at least when I went back to school, was part of the humanities. And then you would read books on Plato and Homer's Odyssey. And a lot of people, if you were like me, you're probably wondering, why am I even reading this? What's so great about this? What's the impact? But now, as I look back, I realize how important it is, because contained within all these books, there's a certain wisdom about how we can preserve our humanity over time. This wisdom is transmitted through various stories, through various types of whether it be similes, like the story, or let's say a story of Atlantis, created by Plato. Or some people might believe that it actually existed, but even back then they were using these specific literary artifacts to communicate a specific concept. So now, a few years later, many years later, I appreciate how humanity is really so important. Now, what I read, to my dismay, is that more and more people are, especially the young ones, are heading right into computer land, and whether it be universities, the ones who are still going there and taking courses in computer technology. And again, I want to emphasize it's very important for us to stay ahead, but I think at the expense of humanities. So essentially, we're creating a class of highly specialized beings that only know one aspect, almost like idiot savants, or savants as it's called today. But they have no idea how that technology can be misused down the line. For instance, even though the scientists who worked and collaborated in the Manhattan Project later on began to wonder whether it was such a good idea to develop nuclear bombs, realizing at that point whether it was, and even Oppenheimer himself talked about that. So Philip K. Dick really is very aware about that. If you know anything about him, he actually is someone who talks. He says that some of his major influences were like Faulkner or Proust or even H.P. Lovecraft. I mean, you have a mixture of various literary and philosophical influences in the writings of Philip K. Dick. Now, one thing about those who have never actually read any of his writings, just watch his movies, it seems like it's almost like a stream of consciousness. Most of the work that he did induces in the reader a kind of altered state of consciousness. And I wonder, many years when I picked up Ubik, after a couple of pages, I felt really out of it. And I'm wondering what is just going on. So I read that Philip K. Dick used to write very, very quickly. He was basically being paid pennies per word. And he churned out, I believe, 121 short stories and 44 novels in his short life. Just think about that. Sometimes he would write 4 or 5, 3 or 400-page novels in 1 year. So consequently, he didn't really bother too much with editing the work. He was just on amphetamines, just cranking out tons and tons of information. And what I suspect is essentially what he was doing is letting his unconscious, opening up the doors of his unconsciousness, letting it out. So when you read Philip K. Dick, you're really starting to tap into an unconscious reality, or almost like James Joyce's stream of consciousness. Not something that's a lot of sci-fi writers, say for instance Bradbury or Heinlein, would go back to their writing and re-edit it into a really precise, almost has a mathematical precision of science. In the case of Philip K. Dick, that wasn't quite the case. I believe part of it was his own personality, but also part of it was this idea that there really isn't, that he needed to get this out. It's almost like something inside of him wanted to get this stuff out. Now, his writings basically are, you could say they're broken up into 3 time periods, but the main 2 periods of his writing consist from late 50s till 1974, and 1974 till his death in 1982. Why is that? Well, in 23, what's referred to as 2374, March 2nd, 1974, he had a what's referred to as an experience. He was waiting. He apparently was suffering from an impacted tooth, and he was waiting for what I understand, a representative from the pharmacy to show up with the painkiller. So he opens the door and he looks at her, and then he stares at what appears to be a fish, but it's all this symbol of the early Christians. And what he claims afterwards is a pink beam shot from that, knocked him out on the forehead, and he fell on the floor. And now, for a few moments, he felt he was no longer in the U.S. in 1974, but he was transported back to ancient Rome. And if those who have seen his 1977 speech in Metz, uh, and also the reaction of the audience will testify that he's talking about that experience, that we live in a computer generated reality. Now, you might think, well, that's the Matrix. Well, he didn't call it the Matrix. He actually called it the Black Iron Prison. That is, this is a kind of a world that has been created, and we're falling under its spell, according to him, back from 70 AD. So you might think, well, come on, that's just absolutely strange. Maybe he was schizophrenic, he was weird, he's strange. I prefer his early writings. But what I would argue is that, in fact, if you go back to his early writings, like I think the Eye in the Sky, where he looked up one day, he looked at the sky and he saw a huge opening. He saw this evil mechanical grin staring back at him, and he was so frightened he actually ran up to Bishop Pike, who at that and understand what, and Bishop at that time was Episcopalian, explained to him this may have been the face of Satan. So Philip K. Dick's his writing is infused with theological or theophanic thinking. It is not just pure sci-fi. This is why I actually, when I first read him, I started with Phallus and Divine Invasion and Transmigration of Timothy Archer, and went backwards to, say, Man of the High Castle. I really fell in love with his writing. I think they really spoke to not just pure sci-fi. I mean, I read sci-fi. I had read Asimov and Heinlein and Bradbury and all these guys. But when I find in Philip K. Dick someone who goes beyond that, and he's really speaking to something that we rarely argue, we rarely talk about, which is the idea of what is reality, what is the concept of reality, which we take for granted. Now, in this discussion, I am not just going to focus on the philosophical or aspects, and certainly, even though Philip K. Dick remain an Episcopalian most of his life, his conclusions about the nature of reality really are traditional conclusions. That is, all the revealed religions, whether it be Hinduism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, they all basically speak of the same, different words, but the same experience. Well, for the purpose of this talk, I'm not really going to focus too much on that. I'm not going to go down the road of philosophizing or what can or cannot, because there are actually a lot of better authors or philosophers than myself out there who have spoken extensively on Philip K. Dick's Gnostic vision of the universe. But what I'm going to focus is more the literary and / artistic interpretation of what we need to do. So going back to the issue of the Black Iron Prison. What is the Black Iron Prison? Philip K. Dick, in his first, by the way, he continued always to revise what his experience was. And in fact, I have this book over here for those who are wishing to read it. It's quite a challenge. It's called The Exegesis of Philip K. Dick. Jonathan Lethem, Pamela Jackson edited. Before he wrote, basically this is an edited version of more than 10,000 pages of speculation on the nature of experience. He's definitely had an experience. And a lot of people who have read his writings will conclude that it's not just a schizophrenic rambling or some sort of psychotic break, but it's probably closer to a mystical experience or some sort of revelation that came from somewhere in his mind or his connection to the higher mind. And he, for many years after his experience till his death, he continued to explore what that was. And to his credit, he didn't create another religion. He didn't create another, which he could have done. In the case of some other writers we're familiar with, he didn't do that. Instead, he decided to maintain the qualities of critical thinking. He felt critical thinking was absolutely essential. Always challenge your own belief systems. Always challenge your dogma. He felt that that's so important. That was going to be a big problem in the years to come, which is obviously what's happening in today's age, where everybody is into their own echo chamber, and they vilify or project the shadow to someone else. And that's really what we're looking at today. So one of the things I want to start out with, one of the takeaways from his more philosophical explorations, which you can see in the Exegesis, or you can see in this book. See if I can find it right now. This is another great book. See if I can catch it. It's Philip. I'm doing two screens in case you're wondering why I'm looking in both directions, is because I'm actually speaking two screens at once. Philip K. Dick, Selected Writings and Philosophical Writings by Lawrence Sutton. A great book I would recommend. So if you really want to start appreciating more his writings, why, for instance, in The Man in the High Castle, one of the characters uses the Yi Jing to kind of switch universes. And because Philip K. Dick was very much interested in how Eastern religion or philosophical systems impact the nature or describe the nature of our reality. So as you begin to read more his writings beyond just his literary or sci-fi, you begin to really appreciate more the person behind that. And certainly knowing what happened to him back in 2374, it's really critical. I really do feel, and everybody's entitled to their own opinion, I do feel that something did happen in 2374, a kind of revelation, some sort of insight into the nature of reality. Philip K. Dick had been talking about that many years prior, back as early as in the mid 60s when he had that experience of seeing an eye in the sky. But he feels that Valis, or his experience, 2374, was a kind of the omega point, the crystallization of everything that had happened from the moment he felt he had lost his fraternal sister when she died a few weeks after he was born, and all the way to the present. He felt that experience, 2374, the Valis experience, which stands for Vast Active Living Intelligence System, is it was a crystallization of that. So everything came to a kind of of that. And of course, you try to explain it. So the Black Iron Prison is a kind of spell that we fall under. Now, in the movie The Matrix, we talk about that extent. They talk about it, and they refer to the Welcome to the Desert of the Real as being as the base where you all basically are plugged in, have we're supported, or basically our energy, we're like basically batteries in this vast web of that's created by these machines. However, in his case, the Black Iron Prison is now we are living in this reality, and the real reality is something that for maybe a few mystical people have experienced. But there are also layers too about the disinformation matrix. So imagine that the Valis, whatever that experience is, he breaks it down into two parts. That there was a creator, and then this creator created something called Zebra, which is a kind of an artifact. And the function of the artifact at that point was to project, to download into the world a kind of a simulation of itself. And the whole goal, this is from a philosophical and theological perspective, was for the creator to know himself or itself. But at some point, the simulation took over. The simulation at some point began to disconnect more and more from what the creator was doing and began to create its own simulation. And hence, Philip K. Dick talks about the counterfeit world. And I do believe instinctively this, what we've seen since basically the mid 2000s, right, is a kind of a disintegration of this counterfeit reality. We've seen so many narratives almost every day, and it's honestly a lot of. I'm sure a lot of people are very disoriented. It's like one day we'll talk about UFOs, the disclosure movement. Another day we'll talk about AI, how AI is going to displace 20 million people or 200 million people. Another day we'll talk about how such and such a candidate is the worst ever. Another day we're talking about, it's like there's so much fragmentation. There is a lot of fragmentation, and there is very little unity. And this is what Philip K. Dick was warning us, because technology accelerates the fragmentation. So the technology, which you could say is kind of an aspect of the counterfeit system that we've created through this zebra-like entity, continues to accelerate and put out more and more information. Now, technology by itself is not bad, but unless it's guided by wisdom, unless it's guided by that sense of humanity, it's going to lead us nowhere. It's going to actually continue to break into smaller and smaller pieces until we're all these nomads existing in a solipsistic universe completely apart from everybody else. And I don't think most of us want that. So what Philip K. Dick talks about is the idea is, well, how do we deal with it? How do we fight? How do we combat the disinformation matrix? Again, I want to emphasize, I'm talking about more from a literary or from an artistic point of view, not so much for philosophical, whether or not you believe there was a being that created this zebra. And then for our purposes, it is right now cascading into our own lives. Like we go out there and we are confronted the minute we step out of our door with so much information. So what is the reaction of most people? They withdraw. So they enter into their own reality tunnel. So they don't do much. What they basically stick to what they know, and that's it. But unfortunately, reality comes around and knocks on everyone's door. Sooner or later, they're gonna have to deal with that reality. So if someone's afraid of, they're afraid of, they're not. They say, well, AI is just in the future. I'm not worried. Well, let's face it. What's happened. Let's look at the pandemic. Let's how so much has changed since the pandemic. And the technology was almost in place. Zoom was something that few people use here and there. But after the pandemic, all of a sudden, that's become like Xerox now. When I say, well, we're going to have a talk, I'm going to go on Zoom, even though it could be StreamYard, which we're in, or Facebook Live. But that's become almost a commonplace. So technology is certainly there to help us. So we really need to, instead of falling to the reality tunnel of conspiracy theories, which is what most people do, is that I want to emphasize the importance of having critical thinking and understand that there is a fragmentation that's happening at a ever rapid pace. I mean, you could actually claim that fragmentation starts back in the 1800s, and with the Industrial Revolution, and then the advent of postmodernism, and it continues to basically devour itself. Now, let's step back for a second. If you want to, people always say, well, when we talk about the pyramids or classical art, and why was that important? Because that from many perspectives, that appealed to a sense of harmony, a sense of the golden mean. You guys have talked about the golden mean with the golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequences, symmetry. That was very important because it appealed to an aspect of ourselves that is seeking that kind of wholeness, which in this book, by the way, this is another book I want to emphasize. Ian McGilchrist, The Master and His Emissary. In this book, he talks about that exact issue. The right brain is, without falling into the stereotypical definition of the right-left brain, it attends to reality very differently than the left brain. And art, literature, poetry, meditation, prayer, they're all basically right brain activities. They're all basic. That's why they appeal to, there's something in us. When we step into, say, a cathedral, or we'll step into a mosque, or maybe step into a synagogue, regardless of whether or not we're really we really are necessarily believe that specific tradition. There's something that is truly inspiring about that. And we need to separate the two. Oh, well, I don't believe in that religion, so I'm not going there. Or I don't. That's not the point. The point is in the built into the architecture. There's an understanding, especially say in the Gothic architectures, which sprung right after the Knights Templars in the 13th and 14th century Europe. There's a sense of symmetry, of balance. That was the whole idea, because through that balance, through that unification, we can connect with a transcendent self. But that's missing today. A lot of the architecture that's out there, a lot of the writing, a lot of the thinking, a lot of the technology is missing. That's why we're collapsing into this fragmentation, into this world that this everything is splitting apart. And again, I want to emphasize part of that fragmentation may be a calling, maybe a way to point the fact that we need to go back to the source. We need to return to the source. So how do you return to the source? So let's say I was to write a book tomorrow about the nature of reality or the nature of the fragmentation, and it ends up stepping on many people's toes. The immediate reaction will be to vilify me or to vilify the book. Well, this is wishful thinking. This is not true. Sounds like a cult or whatever. And I really appreciate what you're saying. That's how the disinformation matrix works, or how the virus works. You remember in the Matrix how you had the agents, like Agent Smith, right? And the minute he sends someone that seems to be exposing the Matrix, he would go after them. But there was in the Matrix, there's one character called Morpheus. Or then eventually we have someone called Eno, which is kind of a Christ-like figure. But Morpheus is the one that was exposing the Matrix. But what if you expose the Matrix? Guarantee in this world, if you expose what this world is all about. For instance, Whitney Webb, for those who are not familiar with her writings, it's really going into detail about the corruption that took place behind the whole Epstein and his networks of transhumanism and so on. And she decided to go and live in Chile because she felt that at this point she would be targeted. And if you read her writings, agree or not, they're very well researched. Whitney Webb, and there are other writers. There are some political candidates out there, which I'm not going to go into names, but that are exposing the matrix. They're exposing the corruption. They're exposing what's happening. Guarantee you do that, they'll come after you. They'll come after you, and they will try to either discredit, or if not, they buy you out, discredit you, or if not, the worst thing is they'll just ignore you. Either way, this is happening. And this is why, if you look at all the traditions going back thousands of years, there has been talk about, there are in the writings of those traditions, there is an understanding that if you follow certain practices, you will come to a whole, a reconnection. Even someone like Carl Jung talked about that. He talked about that struggle between in his interpretation of the story of Job, between the conscious and the unconscious. Same way, this fellow talks about that. There is a here you go. There is a struggle between the left brain and the right brain, and essentially the left brain is taking over. Left brain is the one that's behind linearity, sequencing, classification, and again, these are all good things, but at the expense of the right brain. So what you're seeing is a disintegration of what the right brain has to offer, a almost holistic interpretation of reality, and focus more on the left brain. And unfortunately, a lot of the young men and women who go into technology very rarely go into the humanities, very rarely appreciate it. So what they do is, what do? They create an app or another application that is extremely left brain. And I'm not, how many of you out there have looked at this and I'm wondering, wow, I mean, this is kind of, it makes sense, right? Well, it does, because what we're looking at is a kind of a self-perpetuating realities, very much like Philip K. Dick's information virus. The information virus, which is created by Zebra, which is this artifact created by reality, is designed to simulate reality, but eventually it takes over reality. It takes over the original substrate. And then it creates this So we kind of sense we're living in a fake news world. It's a fake news reality. So how do you get out of it? How do you get out of it? That's really what I wanted to get into. How do you, from a literary or a artistic point of view? Well, the first thing is, what I would recommend is to really focus on a way to counter what Philip K. Dick talks about, counterfeit the counterfeit, which is simple. The counterfeit is always, just imagine that the counterfeits is like Agent Smiths, always looking out for things that could potentially disrupt the matrix or disrupt the black iron prison. And the minute it sees it, it preempts it. One way of preempting is commercializing it. Let's face it, it buys you out. So something that's good, that's powerful. All mystical traditions to some degree have been commercialized, have been preempted, unfortunately. All organized religions to some degree. I'm not saying if you belong to one, you still belong to it, but understand there is corruption within all major institutions. The original mystical impulse is there, but then it gets preempted by the by the disinformation agents. And this goes back thousands of years. We're not talking about it. There's nothing new under the sun here. But how do you fight it? Well, you've seen the case in some religious traditions, like in the case of Christ when he comes, whether or not you believe in what happened to him or whether or not you believe in the crucifixion, clearly, at the very least, a lot of people would agree that he was some sort of, he challenged the system and he paid for it. And the same applies to other people. Mani, who introduced Manichaeism. Others who have, and what about all the saints and the martyrs as well? So something is going on that we really need to pay attention to. So how do you do it? Well, the first thing is there are literary devices. For instance, what we're doing at our festival is a kind of subversive way of getting the word out. Making films that expose the matrix, because people say, "Oh, that's just entertainment." That's great. Keep them thinking that it's entertainment, because if they think it's serious, they're gonna come after you. But within the entertainment framework, introduce ideas that are really, really challenging, that make people think. For instance, The Matrix, the movie, is a prime example. I remember when it first came out, a lot of commentators at that point, they referred to it as a mishmash of Buddhism, Christian eschatology, and a little bit of Zen, and they were very confused. But notice, 20 years later, it's still, in very fact, we're even using that term today. And other people have used the term, suggests something, it resonates with us. And that's really the key that I want to emphasize. Introduce within the disinformation, the product that you put out, a element of truth that challenges people to look at the reality around them and say, there's got to be a better way. And within that, introduce a solution. So essentially, this is what Philip K. Dick talks about, counterfeit the counterfeit. Because if you try to oppose it head on, you're going to lose. Or you'll be turned into a martyr. You'll be vilified. You'll be discredited. You might even have the IRS after you. You're wondering what's going on. If you're really challenging the matrix directly, head on, guarantee you'll have Agent Smith at your doorstep. But yet you want to, because for those of you out there, you realize, hey, look, this world, it's very strange. I want to do something. I don't want to just run to the hills and forget about it. So what do I do? What do I do? And that's really the question that we really need to address. So one thing is, again, keep creating. For those who are filmmakers, keep creating within the framework, whether it be science fiction or supernatural stories, where the character gets to expose the matrix. Now, in the original Matrix, there really isn't a solution. It's kind of strange. What I would suggest is that go one step beyond what we saw in the original story of the Matrix. Introduce solutions where the character achieves kind of a wholeness, where using Jungian terminology, where you introject or incorporate the shadow. The darkness is not bad. Darkness is a call that we need to go beyond it. It's a call we need to return to the whole, to the source. So in a lot of New Age interpretation, let's focus on the light, let's focus on this, let's focus on that. The flying saucers are our friends, they're our buddies. big mistake, because essentially we're again trying to project what we need to work on ourselves onto others, onto a religion system. So Philip K. Dick really talks about the importance of really working on yourself and within a framework. Now, I think he found that the religious framework was useful, uh, but on this, understand you got to do the work yourself. Second thing he also says, whatever you do, you just can't run off to the hills and disappear. You need to be able to share this information with others so they also wake up. And he referred to this concept of anamnesis. Anamnesis referred to waking up from that state of sleep, which we, according to him, we've been experiencing for thousands of years. So it's not just about you, because we're all part of a larger whole. Yeah, we're different. And that duality, that contradiction, we're a part and part of, it's integrated into the right brain, into our right brain. Our right brain understands. For instance, let's look at Zen koans. What is what the classic is? What is it? If a branch falls down from a tree and no one can hear it, does it fall down? What is the sound of one hand clapping? A lot of people say this is just garbage, but the truth is, the whole idea of the Zen koan, which is used in Japanese in Zen Buddhism, is to wake us up, is to appeal to the right brain, to the other mind, to wake us up from the duality that exists in this reality. Going back again, using a Christian tradition, and I'm not saying that everybody is Christian here, but going back to it, if you look back to the original Garden of Eden story, again, it's a metaphor. After eating from the fruit of the good and evil, the tree of good and evil, we fall into duality. The tree of knowledge was somewhere else, was it? We're not. So we need to accept we are in a dualistic universe, because that's part of something that happened or happened to us thousands of tens of thousands of years ago. Now, some people might say it had to do with, again, the left brain taking over. That before we were living in this kind of neo-blissful state of right brain consciousness. And in fact, Julian Jaynes in the breakdown of the bicameral mind talks about it, and Philip K. Dick, by the way, was well aware of him, that we lived in a kind of blissful reality, and that there was no real separation between internal and external reality. Now, again, that's up to this interpretation and discussion and challenge. Some people believe that's true. You can take the religious perspective, you could take the philosophical, you could take the scientific perspective. It's more of a right brain consciousness. Regardless of the perspective you take, the experience that you're going to have is more of unity, of connection, not just with aspects of who you are, but with all of reality. So Philip K. Dick talks about whatever you do, you need to bring along the others. When you climb up that mountain, you're at the top. You don't want to be by yourself. You want to have everybody else with it. Essentially, he's almost invoking a Buddhist bodhisattva tradition of the enlightened being who comes back to earth so he can take everybody along with him back to the source. And that's one thing that a lot of people often forget. It's not about me and my enlightenment. It's about our enlightenment, our understanding of the nature of reality. And again, for those who don't necessarily go the philosophical or mystical tradition, you can still do it in a way that's by contributing, by creating. A failure, if the according to Philip K. Dick, the failure of the imagination is the beginning of the disinformation matrix. It's the beginning. Remember that this being that is simulating has no consciousness, doesn't have a life of its own. It's basically, again, Christian is the ape of God. It counterfeits. It keeps simulating and simulating and simulating and simulating. That's why I really ask all of you who are there, who are writers, do not fall to the trap of ChatGPT and writing your scripts. ChatGPT could be great for organizing perhaps presentations, but don't really, when it comes to writing a script, it's got to come from yourself. It might help you with some headliners, but don't really let it write itself, because then you will essentially, again, be abdicating your personal power to the technology. Back in the early 20th century, when glasses were developed, the whole idea was to correct your vision, so it eventually would throw them away. That was the original idea. Not to have, okay, well, I'm wearing glasses, and then in 5 years, well, I gotta get stronger glasses. But they're designed specifically to keep us connected to the technology. And a lot of technology today is very much like that. For instance, you step into a city, say you go to a foreign country. Uh, Instead of, let me see what Google Map has to tell me, just go out there and look at the signs, get an orientation, because by doing so, you will be connecting yourself with the other part of your brain, the more ancient part of your brain. Instead of saying, okay, I'm on such and such a street, take a left, make a right, walk 5 blocks. The more reliance on technology, the less more you become a slave of that. And that's what this information system wants us to do, to become slaves of it. But at some point, it also wants us to wake up to the reality that there's a reality behind it. So it's kind of paradoxical in nature. It almost goes back to the idea of the story of Job, right? And in the Old Testament, the idea is that the devil or Satan is not necessarily an adversary; he actually works for God. God sends him out to test and challenge men. That's one interpretation. So some people say, well, Christianity is not really dualistic in nature. It still is not dualistic, but how we interpret it, it is. So the key is this: to really understand that there is a relationship between what you do and what you create and what others incorporate. So the first thing is counterfeit the counterfeit. So for instance, look around. Whether you want to, for instance, let's say you want to write something about the corruption in politics, right? Rather than falling into the traditional literary tropes of the good guy versus the bad guy, think of another way where you can incorporate that information. Where, for instance, the character is a good guy, but he's got a dark side. And by working on his dark side, he also enables the others to work on their dark side. The key is to counterfeit the counterfeit. Use literary frameworks, whether it be scientific or philosophical or dramatic frameworks, and with that clear understanding, throw truth into it. The last thing you want to do is to add to the postmodernist vision of reality, which a lot of people do. It's a kind of a cynical or a kind of it's a take on reality that it doesn't really help. It only creates, well, it's just one world where everybody dies, everybody suffers. It's all nihilistic. The key is, if you really do believe in what Philip K. Dick was talking about, that there is an underlying reality that's holding us up. Hans Kung, Kung, talked about that. There's a certain reality, and this is primal trust, as John Gebsa talked about. Primal trust. And that's the reality you want to reconnect. So how do you do it? You do so through these literary devices, but also films, texts, books, introducing the solution within the framework, which it seems ostensibly the framework that you're throwing in is is innocuous to the information bomb or the information virus out there, because he will be looking for things. The truth is, if you go out there and really start searching for, say, solutions, whether it be in medicine or in psychology, or you wonder, well, these solutions work. How is it that everybody's not using it? I mean, I'm sure some of you have thought about that. Why is it that everybody's not? Why is it they always pick the same 12 clowns and give them all this money, whether it be scientists or writers? And these people who are on the cutting edge rarely get credit. And think about Tesla, the original Nikola Tesla. I'll give you an example. There is a reason. There is a reason, guys. It's not just, oh, well, he just happened to have poor business skills. No, I think what these men have done, men and women have done, is that they challenge the matrix. They challenge the system. The children shuts them down. They say, oh, my God, this guy is going to rock the world. No, we don't want him. We don't want him. And the same can apply in the fields of medicine. It can in the fields of psychology, for instance. In the field of psychology, there are several traditional systems of dealing with PTSD. For those who haven't followed me, I'm actually I work as a coach. Well, I like to call myself a therapist or a coach or an assistant, a facilitator. But I work with some veterans of war, and a lot of these treatments exist, and yet what are we being told now? Okay, well, you gotta go for the pharmaceuticals, go for these other very extreme versions of it. Say ayahuasca. Ayahuasca does work with a lot of people, but I remember even with ayahuasca, you gotta use it. There's a follow up. You gotta still work with a therapist. You gotta still work with one that will humanize that experience. So it's not like just gonna pop in a DMT, uh, smoke it, or go in ayahuasca retreat and that's it. You'll be better. No, yeah, there's a process, a practice, and the same applies to other systems out there. So the truth is, really good stuff is being held from us. This is, again, go to the sources and find out. You'll be shocked. You'll be shocked. There'll be an awakening experience. But again, the minute you go out and say, "Hey, listen, all this stuff is amazing," you're gonna have so many people out there that will come after you, and they'll throw the best weapons to completely discredit you. And that's why someone like Philip K. Dick, even now, they say, "Oh no, the 2374, that was some kind of crazy. He took too much acid back in the 60s. He was an amphetamine user. It was a psychotic break." I would say none or all of the above or more. Who is to say having these experiences is not kind of accelerating, kind of awakening? But if you look at the experience itself and how he interpreted, it speaks volumes about the quality of the experience. And it may be one of those coming to Jesus moments, the road to Damascus moments, a mystical experience. And their mystics have been and exist in all traditions, and we call them mystical. And in fact, these are just experiences that exist and that potentially will open up to all of us if you allow yourself, if you open up. And that's why Philip talks about that. Yeah, and in fact, there's a famous quote where he says, in this fake world that we live in, the most important is to really, the sign of compassion and connecting is to be able to be empathic to your fellow human being. Because Philip at some point must have understood that we're all connected at some level. And in fact, back in the early 70s, his house where he lived back in Los Angeles and in Berkeley, San Francisco, he would have all sorts of people coming in and out, in and out. Some of them took advantage of them, some of them don't. His doors were open, and I think if he was alive today, he would really be shocked at what's happening. Even though he probably realized he'd be vindicated by a lot of what's going on, so the truth is out there. So we need to continue to going and getting the word out to others. It's not just just ourselves, right, off to a mountain or to a cave and meditating on, or writing books on the nature of existence and feeding our ego. We got to let go of the ego, because it's at the ego is the way the information virus controls us. And that's very much, again, this book here in this, the master and his emissary, the ego. So we gotta have strong egos, but at the same time we gotta let go, because in the other there's a part of us that is egoless, and you can achieve it through meditation, through mantras, through chanting, through prayers, through drumming, through art, through poetry. All these ways, a lot of them have been discredited, and yet there's a source, a treasure trove of wisdom that we really need to incorporate in our lives. So I invite all of you to continue writing, to continue creating, whether it be use your imagination, unleash the powers of your imagination. It's really the key here. And let your imagination roam free. Now, if you do come across something that is revolutionary, be careful with that, because again, if it's revolutionary, people will try to shut it down. We also, what do you mean? Free energy or a treatment in psychology? Guaranteed that will happen, because the status quo doesn't like quick change. It has to be done over a very, very slow period of time. And that's really the key thing. Always mask it with something else. So introduce the truth as a counterfeit. to the reality, because we're living in a counterfeit reality. So by counterfeiting the counterfeit, you got reality. You got something that will allow to spread virally. We live in its and people will begin to wake up. There's an old movie, actually a short video. Forget now. I'll put it in the links. This is with Radiohead out there. Those who are familiar with the British band, it's very simple video. During the song, you have a bunch of executives out there. They're speaking something to someone else. They whisper something, and the person, after realizing what it is, they lie on the floor and they don't move. I forget the name, but I will put it on the link before, because that's exemplifies, embodies a kind of transmission that we need. So artists are essential, are absolutely critical. We really need, more than ever, we need artists that expose the matrix, that expose the information bomb, that expose it in a way that really gets into people's unconscious, not just literary. Because if the ego gets involved in analyzing and criticizing, then it doesn't work. It will all its defenses go way up. But if it gets through to the unconscious and begin to realize, I feel good after watching this, I feel whole, I feel redeemed, I feel ennobled, then you had something. And that's the key thing. All these great movies that have been going back last 100 years have that quality. And the key is to continue doing that, to continue writing, to continue producing films, to continue to do writing scripts, making films, works of art. But remember, but keep in mind that it's not just a work of art, because unfortunately the trend has been to, with some artists, is to join the postmodernist stream, and thinking that maybe their idea that at some point people will wake up to the absurdity of this art. But no, people keep gobbling up. So be careful about that. I would say return to more of the classical roots in literary theory or philosophy, classical, because that, at the very least, we know within the classical tradition, there's an appeal to right brain consciousness. The more modernist or postmodernist tradition is more left brain fragmentation. We're already dealing with tons of fragmentation. So do you really want more? I mean, that's the key. Do you want more fragmentation? Or do you want at least a balancing? And the Taoist system is all about following the Tao, the balance. We're way out of balance right now. Way out of balance. So we need to return to the Tao. We return to a balanced system, a holistic way of looking at the universe, at the world, at our lives, while at the same time breaking down, having that ability. And that really, art will save us. And for those who don't believe in religious traditions, then you have art. And that can ennoble us to take you to the next level. But remember that a lot of the great discoveries were made from a whole brain or right brain perspective. You know, the reason why certain geometrical structures exist across the world, say the pyramids, the reason is it's not just someone was a mathematician writing down, breaking down. No, it came from within. It came from a kind of the other self, the other mind, the right brain mind, whatever you want to call it, that already has that knowledge and wants to embody it in the form of a pyramid. That's why if you look at a pyramid, whether it be the Mayan pyramids or the Egyptian pyramids, there's a degree of symmetry that appeals that to us, and that it's very connected. Just like if you go to the Gothic cathedrals, so that knowledge is there. This primordial wisdom, which is already embodied, encoded in all of us. So I want to just wrap it up. I just wanted to. What I will do is in the next few weeks, if people are interested, and definitely like this link. If you're on the YouTube channel, please like it. If you the same for Facebook, we're trying to rebuild this platform. My focus moving forward will be on. I'm gonna have a section called "Escaping the Matrix." So Philip K. Dick is one of the ways. There are many others who share different approaches, but our goal is to have tools where we can begin to really learn to navigate this very fragmented world without losing our humanity. And that's the key thing. That's really behind what Philip K. Dick talked about in a lot of his writings. So sci-fi was a framework through which he could get his philosophy out. Imagine him writing philosophy. It wouldn't go. It wouldn't fly. And lastly, for those who really want to know about his writings and his philosophical position, I would say pick up this book, liter- selected writings and philosophical, selected literary and philosophical writings. Lawrence Sutton, Sutin. There is a chapter, I guess a short, it's about 30-page. It's called Cosmogony and Cosmology. Here is probably the closest Philip K. Dick to put together into his writings. Here you go. For those who are, is for instance, I'll just read you a couple sentences to give you a little flavor. This is not sci-fi now. This is as to our reality being a projected framework, it appears to be a projection by an artifact, a computer-like teaching machine that guides, programs, and generally controls us as we act without awareness of it within our projected world. The artifact, which I call Zebra, has created, actually only projected our reality as a sort of mirror or images of its maker, meaning the ultimate reality, which is God in Philip K. Dick's view. So the maker can obtain thereby an objective standpoint to comprehend its own self. In other words, the maker, called by Jacob Boehme, Bohme, the ergon, is motivated to seek an instrument for self-awareness. At some point, the maker begins to appreciate more and more the reality that is created. However, the artifact, Zebra, you might call it the adversary, you might call it the devil, Satan, whatever you want to call it, begins to create and inform more, counterfeit that reality even more. And it becomes then a tug of war, which is very much connected to what happens to the left brain and the right brain, right? In this book. The right brain essentially was what had a complete connection with reality. And at some point, the left brain began to, like an appendage, begin to develop its own sense of identity. And now the master and his emissary, all right, if the master is supposed to be the right brain, and if the emissary is supposed to be the left brain. However, the roles have been reversed. The master is the left brain, and the emissary is the right. And unfortunately, we're seeing the results of that. So whether or not you think about the ergon or the ultimate reality, or is a right brain or left brain disconnection, these are metaphors. At the end of the day, it's the experience you have after having that. So I would recommend picking up this book. Again, great book. It really begin to appreciate his sci-fi writing more when you start to know what he's really all about. He's not just making stuff up randomly. It's all about how he really felt, and he felt about the world. For him, reality was always unstable, felt something off. It might have been because there was a certain part of him that felt guilty that he survived his sister, Jane, who died, I think, a few weeks after he was born. There was maybe a part of him that felt like that. We'll never know. But I think his writings speak for themselves, and that's really what you want to look at. So thank you for being with me for close to an hour. I really wanted to get the word out. I think you guys have been doing an amazing job supporting the website. Again, like the site if you're on YouTube and you're on Facebook. Again, like it. Get the word out, spread it. And I'm hoping in the next couple of weeks to start creating a separate program called Escape the Matrix. And we'll go into tools that exists. But at the end, don't just escape the matrix. Let all of us should escape the matrix. And that's the key thing. Expose the information virus for what it is. It's outdone itself. It's outlived its utility. And it's now time to return back to reality. Maybe that's the name of a song someone should write here. Back to reality. Okay, guys. Well, thank you very much for supporting this, for being here. I hope to hear from some of you. Again, shoot us an email, info@the Philip K. Dick Film Festival. Get the films out. Keep writing. Keep producing. Works. Think of classical thinking. Return to the whole. And I hope to see some of you in next year's festival. I think a lot of good stuff, and we'll see if we can bring some people who were with Philip K. Dick at that time. Thank you very much. You have a good day and stay well, stay centered, stay focused, and live long. Thank you.